why is it wrong peculiarly for human beings to inflict harm on each other?
All right, so let's start with that. Suppose that my 3-year-old nephew walks into your house, takes some book off your shelf, and tears the pages out. He hasn't done anything wrong, or 3-year-old's probably old enough he has done something wrong. Make him a year and a half, he hasn't done anything wrong. If I go into your house, tear some pages out of your book, I've done something wrong. What's the difference? Well, I'm capable of appreciating reasons for respecting your property that my 1.5-year-old, this is hypothetical 1.5-year-old nephew, doesn't have the capacity, right? There are differences between people that allow me and you to think about our behaviors, to evaluate our behaviors, to see whether or not there are legitimate reasons for behaving as we do. Creatures that don't have that capacity don't have that capacity. It's precisely because they lack that capacity that makes no sense that the notion of right and wrong behavior gets no purchase. Lions can't reflect upon their behavior, so when they do it, it's
of social behavior, which they call acting morally.
We might wonder what makes it wrong. And the answer is, well, it's wrong because, for example, rape is wrong because it harms the victim. Is it just a matter of opinion? Now that's tricky. Of course, we're going to be arguing about whether or not God's necessary for morality, what shape morality has, and so forth and so on. And all of that, in some sense, is just a matter of opinion. But I take it the deeper question is there a fact of the matter as to who's right? Now, just as there's a fact of the matter as to whether or not there is a God and what that God is like, I take it there's a fact of the matter with regard to whether or not it's wrong to harm people, whether it's wrong to rape, for example. I think it's wrong to rape. I take this to not just be a matter of opinion. It's not as though if I thought otherwise rape would be okay, or if everybody thought otherwise rape would be okay. Rape is wrong, full stop. So at least if you're worried about whether there could be genuine morality, where there are facts of the matter, then on an atheist account, I'm inclined to think, well, of course there can. We might wonder what makes it wrong. And the answer is, well, it's wrong because, for example, rape is wrong because it harms the victim. Might ask instead, what do we mean in saying that it's wrong to rape? Now, this is a controversial matter, and not all moral philosophers agree about the ingredients that we need to build into the basic definition of right and wrong. But roughly, I take it that as at least a first pass, the thought is something like to believe in morality as a genuine, objective state of affairs is to believe that there are reasons to act morally, to help others and to avoid harming them, and that these reasons don't depend on the particular desires or goals you happen to have. It's not as though if you happen to care about truth, justice, and the American way, then you've got a reason to act morally. No, everybody has these reasons. These reasons are overriding, to use philosophers' jargon, they're categorical reasons. So when I say that it's an objective fact that rape is wrong, what I'm saying is there's this kind of overriding, strong, categorical reason not to harm people in this way. And that's not up to me to make it so, it's just so. Now, we might ask, is there a deeper account that can be offered about where these reasons come from, or what makes them so, or the basic rules of morality, what their ultimate foundation or basis is? And I want to say that secular atheist philosophers disagree about that point. Some are, as we might call them, non-foundationalists. They say, well, we can state the various moral rules, keep your promises, tell the truth, don't tell lies, don't hurt people, help the needy. And if we want, we can boil these rules down into a simpler set of rules. I've suggested don't harm, do help. But there may be nothing at all deeper to be said about what makes those rules the valid rules. It's just an objective fact about reality that there are these categorical reasons. There are reasons to behave in certain ways versus other. So that's not just a matter of opinion. There are facts about what there are reasons to do. And these may be among the reasons that there's nothing deeper to say. But there are also philosophers who believe there is something more to say. And again, unsurprisingly, different philosophers will disagree about what that deeper story looks like. Let me give a very quick sketch of one such story. I think it's not bad as far as it goes. Ultimately, I think there's even more to say, but that would take us a rather long time to say that more, so let me just give you the quick sketch. It's a version of the view that's known as contractarianism. The thought is that the moral rules are the rules that we would give to one another to govern our interactions with one another, the rules that we would agree to if we were to set about trying to settle on a bunch of rules to govern our interactions under the assumption that we were perfectly rational. Nobody wants to follow rules that people accept because of mistakes in their reasoning. So imagine us, but soup ourselves up to be reasoning perfectly rational beings would agree to various rules to govern their interactions. And the rules that they agree to are the terms of morality. Now, there's different ways of running this contractarian thought. One version of it, which I have some sympathies to, adds an extra twist. The reasoning needs to take place behind a so-called veil of ignorance. The thought is, I'm not going to know while I'm engaged in this hypothetical bargaining session what my actual position in society is. I won't be able to try to rig things in favor of white males because I won't know that I'm a white male. So I argue from behind this veil of ignorance about my actual identity. So that's the basic thought. So here we have a kind of deeper story. Where do the moral rules come from? They are the rules we would give to ourselves to govern our behavior with one another insofar as we were perfectly rational. Does this capture a notion of objectivity for ethics? Seems to me the answer is yes. There's a fact of the matter about what it would be rational for us to agree to in terms of these rules. One might wonder, is the output of this hypothetical imaginary bargaining session, are the moral rules necessary? Maybe that's another feature we're looking for in trying to genuinely get morality as opposed to merely the illusion or appearance of morality. And the answer to that is yes, I believe they are necessary. Now, if you're a non-foundationalist, if you don't think there is a deeper story of the contractarian sort that I sketched, or some other deeper story that other moral philosophers have sketched, if you're a non-foundationalist, you might just stop it right here. You might say, to say that murder is wrong is to say that there's a categorical reason not to murder, and this isn't a contingent truth, it's a necessary truth. It's a truth that obtains, as philosophers like to put it, in all possible worlds, that murder would be wrong. If we do go the contractarian route, then we instead might put our necessity a little bit deeper. We might say something like, the moral truths are necessary, but their truth is itself explained in terms of the social contract, and that in turn is explained in terms of the fact that there are certain truths about reasoning, and these are necessary truths. It's a necessary fact that perfectly rational beings would reason about what kinds of rules they wanted to give to one another in such and such a way. So I think we can get the necessity of morality as well. Here's a rather different objection that might get raised. We have the thought that morality involves commandments. We have the thought that morality involves requirements. We talk about moral laws. So sometimes it's suggested that where there's a commandment, there's got to be a commander. Where there's a law, there's got to be a lawgiver. Where there's a requirement, there's got to be a requirer. Who plays the role of commander, lawgiver, requirer? Well, it's got to be God. And so it turns out if we're really going to have the notion not just of moral reason to behave in this way or that way, but rather moral requirements to behave in one way rather than another way, then we need to appeal to God after all, to be the lawgiver. This is an argument that's been proposed by various theistic philosophers. Indeed, this very argument's been embraced by some atheistic philosophers who said, yeah, talk of moral requirements does presuppose a lawgiver. Now that I no longer believe in God, I believe there are no moral requirements. Now, I'm not myself inclined to go that way. I'm perfectly prepared to talk about moral requirements. I think it's a completely appropriate thing to do. In fact, it would be inappropriate, it would be just simply mistaken, full stop, to give up talk about moral requirements. So the question I want to push a little bit is it really true that requirements require a requirer? That's a mouthful.
Kagan's argument is grounded in some of the most well-respected traditions in philosophy and science. First, the claim that laws require a lawgiver is a category mistake. We talk about laws in physics, like gravity or thermodynamics, but no one thinks there's a divine being issuing those. Moral laws can function the same way. They describe how rational beings ought to treat each other, especially when suffering, fairness, or autonomy is involved. Second, Kagan's appeal to contractarianism isn't abstract theory. It reflects real-world values we use to build just societies. Think of the U.S. Constitution. It wasn't handed down from heaven. It was written by people trying to reason through fairness from multiple perspectives. That's the same spirit behind Rawls' veil of ignorance, which has influenced everything from ethics in healthcare to international human rights. And science backs this up. Frans de Waal's work with primates shows empathy, fairness, and conflict resolution emerging without religion. In human children, studies from Yale's Baby Lab show moral decision-making before they can speak, proving morality isn't downloaded from above. It's wired into social creatures like us.
The question before us this evening is God necessary for morality? Notice what the question is not asking. We are not asking whether belief in God is necessary for morality. No one in tonight's discussion is arguing that in order to live a moral life, you need to believe in God. Rather, the question, as Shelley emphasized, is whether God is necessary for morality. And the answer to that question, I think, obviously depends on what you mean by morality. If by morality you mean simply a certain pattern of social behavior prevalent among human beings, then obviously this sort of behavior could still go on even if it turned out that God does not exist. God isn't necessary in order for human beings to exhibit certain patterns of social behavior, which they call acting morally. But if by morality you mean that certain things are really good or evil, that certain actions are unconditionally obligatory or impermissible, then many atheists and theists alike agree that God is indeed necessary for morality. In the absence of God, morality turns out to be just a human convention or illusion. The same patterns of social behavior might go on without God, but it would be a delusion to think that such behavior has any objective moral significance. Accordingly, I'm going to argue that God is necessary for morality in at least three distinct ways. Without God, objective moral values, moral duties, and moral accountability would not exist. Let's look at the first point. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Now, when we talk about moral values, we're talking about whether something is good or evil. To say that there are objective moral values is to say that something is good or evil independently of whether anybody believes it to be so. To say, for example, that the Holocaust was objectively evil is to say that it was evil even though the Nazis who carried it out thought that it was good. And it would still have been evil even if the Nazis had won World War II and succeeded in brainwashing or exterminating everybody who disagreed with them so that everyone believed the Holocaust was good. My first claim is that if there is no God, then moral values are not objective in that sense. Traditionally, objective moral values have been based in God, who is the highest good. He is the locus and paradigm of moral value. God's own holy and loving nature supplies the absolute standard against which all actions are measured. He is by nature loving, generous, just, faithful, kind, and so forth. And thus, if God exists, objective moral values exist. But if God does not exist, what basis remains for objective moral values? In particular, why think that human beings would have moral worth? On the atheistic view, human beings are just accidental byproducts of nature, which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust called the planet Earth, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe in which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. On atheism, I can't see any reason to think that human well-being is objectively good, any more than insect well-being or dog well-being or monkey well-being. On a naturalistic view, moral values are just the byproduct of biological evolution and social conditioning. Just as a troop of baboons exhibit cooperative and even altruistic behavior because natural selection has determined it to be advantageous in the struggle for survival, so their primate cousins, Homo sapiens, have similarly evolved behavior for the same reason. As a result of sociobiological pressures, there has evolved among Homo sapiens a sort of herd morality which functions well in the perpetuation of our species. But on an atheistic view, there doesn't seem to be anything that makes this morality objectively true. The philosopher of science, Michael Ruse, reports, the position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, "Love thy neighbor as thyself," they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. End quote. If we were to rewind the film of human evolution back to the beginning and start anew, people with a very different set of moral values might well have evolved. As Darwin himself wrote in The Descent of Man, if men were raised under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. For us to think that human beings are special and our morality objectively true is to succumb to the temptation of speciesism, that is to say, an unjustified bias toward one's own species. The objective worthlessness of human beings on a naturalistic worldview is underscored by two implications of that worldview: materialism and determinism. Naturalists are typically materialists or physicalists who regard man as a purely animal organism. But if there is no mind distinct from the brain, then everything we think and do is determined by the input of our five senses and our genetic makeup. There is no personal agent who freely decides to do something. But without freedom, none of our choices is morally significant. They're like the jerks of a puppet's limbs, controlled by the strings of sensory input and physical constitution. And what moral value does a puppet or its movements have? Richard Dawkins' assessment of human worth may be depressing, but why, on atheism, is he mistaken when he says, there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. If there is no God, then any basis for regarding the herd morality evolved by Homo sapiens as objectively true seems to have been removed. Take God out of the picture, and all you seem to be left with is an ape-like creature on a tiny speck of dust beset with delusions of moral grandeur.
Craig argues that if there's no God, then moral values can't be objective. But that's simply false, and most contemporary philosophers know it. According to a massive 2020 PhilPapers survey of professional philosophers, over 70% believe in moral realism, that objective moral truths exist, while only a minority tie those truths to religion. Craig says evolution makes morality an illusion. But evolution explains how we became aware of morality, not that morality isn't real. Think about pain. It evolved to help us survive, but that doesn't make suffering an illusion. Same with morality. It's an evolved feature that lets us cooperate, prevent harm, and protect the vulnerable. And as for humans being just apes on a rock, that's emotional bait. The truth is, we're rational beings capable of empathy, reflection, and responsibility. Morality arises from our ability to weigh consequences, respect others, and seek fairness. That doesn't require a divine being. It requires thinking beings who care how their actions affect others.
Why is it wrong, peculiarly, for human beings to inflict harm on each other?
All right, so let's start with that. Suppose that my 3-year-old nephew walks into your house, takes some book off your shelf, and tears the pages out. He hasn't done anything wrong, or 3-year-old's probably old enough he has done something wrong. Make him a year and a half, he hasn't done anything wrong. If I go into your house, tear some pages out of your book, I've done something wrong. What's the difference? Well, I'm capable of appreciating reasons for respecting your property that my 1.5-year-old, this is hypothetical 1.5-year-old nephew, doesn't have the capacity, right? There are differences between people that allow me and you to think about our behaviors, to evaluate our behaviors, to see whether or not there are legitimate reasons for behaving as we do. Creatures that don't have that capacity don't have that capacity. It's precisely because they lack that capacity that makes no sense that the notion of right and wrong behavior gets no purchase. Lions can't reflect upon their behavior, so when they do it, it's not wrong. If you or I were to engage in that behavior, we can reflect upon that. We can recognize the reasons for not behaving that way. So I think the distinction is a fairly straightforward one, not a deep mystery or a hard challenge for the naturalist to respond to.
Okay, I think that's a good answer for why we wouldn't regard animals as moral agents who would be culpable for their acts. But it seems to me that at best that answer would go to show that rationality, or the ability to reflect rationally on things, is a necessary condition for moral behavior, but I don't see that that's a sufficient condition for moral behavior. It's still not clear to me why it would be wrong for creatures who have considerably complex neurological systems to inflict harm on each other on a naturalistic worldview in the struggle for survival.
Okay, so the question you asked initially was, how can I explain why it's wrong for me to murder when it's not wrong for lions to murder? And to answer that question, all it takes is for me to point out a relevant difference between us, and you've just, I think, said, yeah, all right, so I managed to do that. If we now shift to the question, so what does it take for wrongness to enter the world above and beyond rationality? I think the answer might well be, actually, once we achieve a certain level of rationality, nothing more is taken. Nothing more is needed. The reason it's objectively wrong for me to engage in murder is precisely because there is a reason for me not to do it, a reason that I'm capable of recognizing. And if you ask, what more does it take? The answer is, well, those are the basic ingredients right there. We can refine it. I mean, we can put a little icing on it if we'd like to make it. But in terms of the essentials, that's it. What there's reason for me to do depends on what kind of creature I am. Once I become the kind of creature in the evolutionary, process, once creatures evolve that are capable of stepping back from their actions, capable of reflecting about whether or not their behavior makes sense, whether it conforms to standards that they are themselves prepared to endorse, at that point the machinery is in place. And at that point there are reasons for me to behave in certain ways and to avoid other kinds of behavior. And if you ask, but what makes that wrong?
I'm still not clear as to why these beings suddenly achieve intrinsic moral worth in virtue of having these complex nervous systems that enables them to have self-reflection and so forth.
If you put it as complex nervous systems, it sounds pretty deflationary.
Right.
What's so special about having a complex nervous system? But of course, that complex nervous system allows you to do calculus. It allows you to do astrophysics. It allows you to write poetry. It allows you to fall in love. Put under that description, you ask, what's so special about humans from a naturalistic perspective? I'm at a loss to know how to answer that question. If you don't see why we'd be special and different from everything else in creation, that because we can do poetry, we can write a novel, we can think philosophical thoughts, we can do calculus, and we can think about the morality of our behavior, I don't know what kind of answer could possibly satisfy you at that point.
Well, obviously, the kind of answer that I offered, but
can I ask just to follow up on that? Because I'm tempted to say I could play this game, and that's unfair, because of course it's not a game, but I could pose the same kinds of questions to you. Perhaps I will, in 10 minutes. I could say, look, all right, so God says, you guys are really, really special.
Right.
So, how does his saying it make us really special? But you see, he gave us a soul. How does our having a soul make us special? Whatever answer you give, you could always say, with regard to that, what's so special about that? At a certain point, you're just going to have to say, you know what? These features really do seem to me to be special. Insofar as it seems to me that our ability to communicate, to reflect, to love, to be creative, and consequently to shape our behavior with an eye towards how we're interacting with one another, these things strike me as remarkable ways in which we're special.
Shelly Kagan's response cuts to the core of what makes morality work: self-awareness, empathy, and rationality. You don't need a divine spark. You need a mind capable of reflection and understanding. That's not a guess. It's supported by data. Cognitive scientists like Michael Tomasello have shown that once humans develop the ability to take another's perspective and understand shared intentions, moral reasoning emerged naturally. We're moral because we evolved the capacity to care, reflect, and cooperate, not because a divine being handed down commands. Craig wants morality to be about divine authority, but his view collapses under scrutiny. If God says something is wrong, is it wrong because he says so, or is it wrong for deeper reasons? That's the Euthyphro dilemma, and Craig never escapes it. If morality comes from God's commands, then genocide, slavery, or torture could be good if God wills it. And history shows this is more than a hypothetical. The Bible condones slavery, patriarchal violence, and genocide. That's not a moral foundation, it's moral hazard. And when Craig downplays evolution, he's ignoring reality. Moral emotions like guilt, empathy, and fairness aren't random. They're observable in humans and even in animals. Studies on capuchin monkeys, for example, show they reject unequal pay. That's a primitive sense of justice. No religion required. In short, Kagan's view fits what we actually see in the world. We don't need a lawgiver to understand fairness. We need minds capable of seeing others as people, not tools. That's what morality is built on. And it doesn't need God to exist. So the real question is, If our brains are wired for compassion and fairness, isn't that a better foundation than ancient rules written by people who thought slavery was moral? Let us know what you think. Drop a comment, like the video if this made sense, and subscribe for more clear, fact-based breakdowns of big questions.